your hometown station.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is KHTS News Director Michael Brown here. And if you've been following along with us, we've been trying to get every single candidate we can for Assembly in here so that way you can be informed and ready for the special election that's coming up tomorrow now at this point. Super Tuesday coming up. Today I'm joined, she's been here before, she's a veteran with KHTS at this point. I'm joined by Suzette Valladares. That's how I pronounce the last name, right?
Yes.
Valladares?
Yes.
Perfect. How you doing,
Good
Suzette?
job. Good. Suzette Martinez Valladares.
Martinez Valladares. Pardon.
Good job. Good job. Good job. I'm doing really great. You know, we have, what is it, maybe 30 hours left before polls close tomorrow for the California 2020 primary. So really exciting, nervous in the best way, and kind of, everything that I could have done at this point, we're doing and have done. So it's all in the voters' hands.
Now, for voters who, a lot of voters out here in the district are familiar with you because you started a congressional campaign first and then decided that you'd be better suited here for the Assembly. You wanted to be more local. For those who may not know you, though, kind of tell us about who you are and why you decided to run for the Assembly seat.
Well, I consider myself a homegrown Assembly district. I was born in Granada Hills, raised in the San Fernando Valley. My first job was at Magic Mountain, the jet stream specifically. Went to College of the Canyons, Cal State Northridge. I started working for Congressman Buck McKeon back in 2009, and that's really when I fell in love with our community, because it was the first opportunity I could work with business owners, with community stakeholders and leaders, and I met my husband here actually in Santa Clarita as well, and decided to make that, this was going to be home because of conservative representatives who represented us at every level from city council to Congress. And it was just an amazing community, so decided to make it home. I decided, you're right, it's been almost a year since I've been campaigning. I initially started to campaign for the congressional race. But really the reasons why I decided to run for the Assembly seat was because of the issues. My brother-in-law actually moved to Texas about a year ago, and because he could no longer afford to live in California. I have my brother who moved to Virginia with my sister-in-law about 6 years ago because my sister-in-law got into law school, and they can no longer afford to move back to California. And just what I was hearing from voters or my own experience with my family was the cost of living was too high, and California policies are crushing the middle class, so people are moving. So, once I had realized that what was affecting my families and what the voters were talking about were issues that were results of failed Sacramento policy, I knew that I had to do something for more locally in Sacramento. And I was really fortunate to have right away had the support of some major stakeholders here in the 38th Assembly District, including Senator Scott Wilk. All of the Santa Clarita City Council actually now has endorsed me, and 3 of the 5 in Simi Valley. So it's been a long ride.
That's quite a sheet you got there.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about getting in because of cost of living expenses. What do those factor into what you'd say would be your top 3
Absolutely.
Key priorities getting in? So what would those 3 be?
Yeah, so we definitely have to address the cost of living, because every other issue that is important to me as well includes the cost of living. So whether it's workforce development locally, right, that's tied to the cost of living. How do we recruit skilled workers if it's too expensive for them to live here? And if you have some type of skill or trade or certificate or degree, do you want to stay here in California, or do you want to move to Arizona? What we're seeing is people are wanting to move to other states. So we have to bring down the cost of living, and really, in order to tackle all of the other issues that we're looking at, affordable housing, the homelessness crisis, are also key things that I'm worried about, as well as supporting small businesses and industry here in the 38th Assembly District.
Now, you say small businesses and industry here. Recently, infamous AB 5 was voted last year and is taken into effect January 1st. For those who don't know, Assembly Bill 5 has to do with contractors.
Right.
It's most notable for Uber, rideshare stuff, but there's other things like truck drivers, freelance journalists, things like that. If you were in Assembly at the time, would you have voted for AB 5, and maybe take me through why or why not?
Absolutely not. And so AB 5 came out of the Dynamex decision, which recategorized or defined how you can classify employees or independent contractors. So we know with that decision there had to be some type of legislation passed to address and codify the Dynamex decision. AB 5 was a horrific piece of legislation. And let's just be real. The reason why AB 5 passed is because we have one-party rule in Sacramento who jam down policy and ram it through for special interest. The one-party rule is what is responsible for AB 5, and we need balance in Sacramento. And because that doesn't exist, they can pass horrible piece of legislation, horrible pieces of legislation like AB5, who really, they rushed it through and they didn't really talk to industry. We knew, Republicans voted against it. Republicans knew, and other industries such as journalists knew, that it was a bad piece of legislation that would have consequence. Now, I think Democrats in Sacramento really overstepped their bounds with rushing this piece of legislation through, because it's really come back to haunt them. And I think they're going to lose a lot of key competitive seats because of this single piece of legislation.
So then what maybe sort of alternatives would you propose, or are you behind, to kind of support small
Right.
businesses and economic growth as opposed to something like AB5?
Well, AB5 specifically has to be repealed. We have to replace it, or actually repeal. My thing has been repeal and protect, and we can get into that long term. It's a longer conversation that needs to be had in order to put together some serious legislation that addresses a Dynamics decision. Outside of that, when it comes to supporting businesses, we have to get rid of some major pieces of regulation and the regulatory overreach and crushing atmosphere that is being placed on business. Specifically, one thing that we can do to address and encourage business in development of housing is by modern CEQA reform. CEQA was a great piece of legislation 30 years ago, or in the 70s, actually more than 30 years ago. Oh my gosh. I can't believe what year is it? It's 2020. It's more than 30 years ago. But it's something that that is making it so ineffective and cost prohibitive to build housing. If we can do something very simple like put a moratorium on CEQA for senior housing or low-income housing, my objective overall would be to really reform CEQA. That's just one example of regulatory reform that we need to spur business.
Gotcha. Now, you talked about the housing crisis and kind of what's been going hand in hand, at least in California,
Yeah.
as housing crisis and homeless epidemic going on here. What is your take on how Sacramento can address both the housing and the
Right.
homeless crisis? Maybe I know it's a complex question there, but
Right.
maybe.
I'm like, wait a minute, how long are we going to be on this show? Okay, so it's a huge question. So when we think of the homelessness crisis, I think for a long time, those in charge have said that it's a housing issue. And they've increased taxes, whether in LA County or in California, to throw billions of dollars at the homelessness issue. Yes, housing is not affordable for working class, middle class, low income families. And I just addressed one of the ways that we can do, one of the things that we can do immediately to spur housing development, which is CEQA reform. The other factors that we have to look at is we have to look at the reality that we have a mental health problem and we have a drug addiction problem. And these are two issues that are near and dear to me. You know, my work with Autism Speaks, understanding developmentally delayed and special needs community, as well as those suffering from mental health issues. I have a niece who has severe mental health issues, anxiety issues, has tried to commit suicide several times. And this is something that is affecting our youth. We have to sit down and really invest in resources and a system that works, because our mental health system in California has failed our students, has failed our families, and it's something that we have to address that is tied to the homelessness crisis. If you look at the homeless population, a third of the homelessness population is suffering from some type of mental health or disorder and not being treated, which exacerbates the situation. If you look at our inmate population, a third of our inmate population is also suffering from some type of mental health or disorder that is not necessarily being treated. We have to address the mental health aspect. Lastly, we have to address the addiction epidemic that we're seeing, whether with opioids, whether it was with legalizing marijuana, which I do believe is somewhat of a gateway drug that has led us to this situation. And that is also tied into public safety and specifically laws that have created this environment that Prop 47, Prop 57. So Prop 47 essentially says that you can go into a Walmart and you can still under $950 worth of merchandise and there not be any consequences. What happened to being tough on crime? We've created a system through bad public safety policy that has exacerbated the homelessness population. I mean, something is deeply wrong with the failed policy coming out of Sacramento that is exacerbating the homelessness crisis.
Now, earlier you mentioned here students and addressing student mental health resources and things like that. We've seen here in the district even an increase in mental health resources, wellness centers,
Yeah.
relaxation rooms. Do you think that things like that could help district-wide and even California-wide, or what do you see helping, high school and
Right.
college-age students with those sort of mental health challenges?
Right. So my experience in the early education community as well as with the autism community is that the earlier you can intervene, the earlier you can diagnose, the earlier you can get intervention services to anybody, whether it's a developmental delay, whether it's a mental disorder, the better chance that they're going to have and of defeating, or I'm sorry, the better chance that they're going to have of getting through that. So, for instance, my niece was diagnosed at 2.5 years old. She was nonverbal on the autism spectrum, had not one word in her vocabulary. She was diagnosed at 2.5 years old. A year later, through early intervention services, she was a little chatterbox that I joke to this day has not stopped. She's 14. She's doing amazing. We have to take this same approach when it comes to mental health in terms of raising awareness, investing resources to make sure that we're intervening as early as possible. And we've stopped doing that. And again, if we think about the failure of our mental health system, which is virtually non-existent, for someone like my niece, either on the autism spectrum or my niece with mental health, anxiety and depression issues, if we think about how bad it is for adults, for our youth, it's even worse. There are less than 3 facilities in LA County alone where if you're a teenager, an adolescent that is having a mental health breakdown, if you are on a 72-hour watch because you tried to commit suicide, it is hard to find a bed for an adolescent, for an adult, yet alone an adolescent. So we absolutely need additional resources and to take a holistic approach to this.
Now, we're talking about education, kind of connecting it to mental health here. I want to connect education to another aspect here in terms of safety, public
Right.
safety. Unfortunately, several months ago, we did have a school shooting here in the district, which connects to things like mental health, connects to the education.
Yeah.
In the wake of that, there was a lot of calls for things like they wanted metal detectors maybe at schools, or they wanted an increase in law enforcement presence, and then there was people who didn't want.
Right.
What's kind of your take on that? How do we prevent things like that from happening in the future, and what can we do to protect students now?
Right. That was a very tragic event that happened to our community, and I have family members that went to Saugus High during that situation, and it was scary. It was scary for me. It's hard for me to talk about it now because of how close to home it hit. And this is home, right? So this is Saugus. This is Santa Clarita. This is home. This is not, some other state. This happened here in our community. I think directly coming out of that, people are asking themselves why. People are asking themselves, how do we stop this from happening again? I think our community relied heavily on faith. I was so blessed to have been able to attend a Grace Baptist ceremony, a celebration of life and just community event. And I love that our community relies on faith for so much because I think it helps us get through moments like what happened last November 14th. And I think, though, when it comes to education, I think that we have to offer additional resources, but we have to sit down with school board members and talk about what is needed. We can have an argument of whether or not metal detectors are needed, but it comes back to this core issue of mental health and making sure that our students are receiving the proper resources to prevent this type of thing from happening in the future.
Gotcha. We've been talking to Suzette Martinez Valladares,
Yes.
who's running for Assembly District 38 here, representing us in Assembly. Thank you so much for joining us, Suzette. If anybody here was wanting to learn about your campaign a little bit, is there a phone number or website they can get a hold of?
Yes, Mike. You can go to SuzetteValladares.com. I'm on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm even on Instagram and TikTok. So check out my TikTok page. It's actually a really fun platform. And remember, tomorrow polls open at 7 a.m. They close at 8 p.m. Vote Valladares March 3rd, or today in LA County.
Thank you so much for joining
Thank
me.
you.
That's right. Tomorrow, everybody, is Super Tuesday. Whether you're Republican, Democrat, Conservative, Liberal, it does not matter. Get out there and vote. It is your right, so go ahead and take advantage of it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I've been Michael Brown.
Your hometown station, KHTS.